Blog
Good
Talk
afternoon.
Radio.
Good afternoon. This is Robert Fisher, and you're listening to Monergy Life. This is a rescheduled broadcast from the show from yesterday. We had some technical problems, and we're excited to get David Sussman on the line from Israel, and hopefully he should be calling in any minute. If you read the description of the episode, it indicated that Israel is rarely outside of the daily news, and today is no exception. Earlier today I was reading two stories about Israel. One was about Israel's cooperation with the Palestinian Authority, creating some tension with Hamas in terms of trying to avoid some of the attacks that have been going on in Israel. And the cooperation has been somewhat delicate with the Palestinian forces. So that article indicated that it's putting some pressure on Hamas, the fact that the Palestinian Authority is cooperating with Israel a bit. The other article, even perhaps more interesting, was an announcement by Iran that they would be calling the so-called martyrs who have been involved in various knife attacks and assaults in Israel, and they would be contacting these families, many of whom have been shot dead by the Israeli Defense Force, and providing them with $7,000 for each martyr that was killed. That's their terminology, not mine. The other thing that they indicated they would be doing is they would be offering $30,000. Hello, David.
Yeah, Robert.
Yes, shalom. Welcome to the show.
Shalom. Thank you for having me.
I was just explaining to our listeners two articles that I was reading about on the internet before starting the show. One was the cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and Israeli forces in terms of going into some of the West Bank areas to prevent some of these knife attacks that are happening all over Israel. And the second article was that the ambassador of Iran in Beirut announced that he would be providing $7,000 for each so-called martyr killed in the recent attacks in Israel, and Iran would also be providing $30,000 for every house demolished by Israel. Interesting, right?
It's interesting, but not surprising. We've seen this from other leaders within the Arab world before Iran, like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, also gave money to Palestinian terrorists, and also the Palestinians themselves. So Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, who is pleading to the world right now for donations and requesting money from the international community when almost a third of their budget is used in order to pay families and the particular terrorists themselves who are in prison. So if you're a terrorist who are sent to an Israeli prison, the Palestinian Authority pays you a certain amount of money that goes into your bank account that you can use in the prison system or wherever you can spend the money. And also, your family will be supported by the Palestinian Authority. So it definitely doesn't come as a surprise to me.
I see. Well, let's back up a bit. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about how you ended up in Israel?
That's a long story.
I know it's a long story, but maybe you can shorten the version a bit, but give some of the salient elements.
To put it in the shortest way possible, growing up, I was a very nomad, a free spirit, you could say, and I was traveling around following this band Fish for many years. And in 2000, the band retired, and I found myself somewhat lost, not knowing which direction I was going to go in and what I was going to do with myself. And I decided I would go to the airport and travel abroad somewhere. And I saw at the very bottom of the screen of all the different destinations that we're leaving, Tel Aviv. I said to myself, I'm Jewish. If I'm going to go explore the world, I might as well start with my heritage and start with where my roots are. So I came to Tel Aviv, and I've been here 15 years now.
Right. And you also have served in a portion of the Army that is designated for foreigners. Is that correct? Is that fair to say? But you were actually...
Yeah, I wouldn't know if I would say that it's geared towards foreigners, because there's actually a unit in the IDF that I guess you could say is similar to, in the olden days, the French Foreign Legions. It's called Machal, and without being a citizen of Israel, you can actually go through training and serve in a number of different units. Some of them elite units within the Army without actually what we call in Israel making aliyah, which means become a citizen. So that would be a particular unit for foreigners, people who aren't actually citizens of Israel. I was already a citizen when I went into the Army, but I was in a very unique unit that was for older people, because I was 27 when I actually joined the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli Army.
I see. And did you actually see combat as part of your experience?
Well, unfortunately, everybody who serves in the Army will eventually see some type of conflict, whether it is a Palestinian with a knife charging at you, and you need to make that split-second decision of how am I going to defend myself, or you are going to have to face the situation where you're working, along the border and you're seeing suspicious activity or a roadside bomb, and you need to call in the proper units to come and to defuse the situation. So my unit that I went into, which actually doesn't exist right now, it was called Shlav Bet, which was for people who are older than 25 years. It was a sort of abbreviated training, and then you went into as a reservist, right? So most Israelis, when they turn 18, will serve 3 years in the Army. Now, you can serve in a number of different capacities. If you're a pacifist and you don't want to carry around a weapon, you don't need to carry around a weapon. There's plenty of opportunities to do work in the Army in an office. You can go into intelligence. You can go into computers. There is a number of different facets to the IDF. So my unit, though, that I went into was abbreviated training, and it was for what is called in Hebrew Totchanim, which is the artillery. So I had a artillery training, and then I was in the reserve duty, which here in Israel we call Miluim. So my first call-up for Miluim, reserve duty, was in 2006, and in the summer, that was for the Second Lebanon War with Hezbollah. So yes, I did see combat.
And what would you say would be some of your main takeaways from that experience? How did it change you in terms of your perspective, not just on Israel, but on the world?
Well, it's a good question. I would say it had more of an impact on me of how I related to myself. And then through my relationship with myself changes the way I view the world, right? It wasn't necessarily change the way that I view the world. Being in conflict and being in near-death experiences where people are shooting at you and things are blowing up around you will definitely alter your perspective on your purpose and your destiny, if you will, here on Earth. So for me, going into the Army, going into the war, I was 29 years old. I was 29 years old when this call-up happened in 2006. And I had a very different background growing up than I think many, not necessarily Israeli soldiers, but, being an American, and I'm sure most of your listeners are American, most Americans who are going into the Army wouldn't necessarily have such a hippie, let's say, background. But here I was, not so long ago, with dreadlocks and a big beard and traveling around in a big van and living this sort of nomadic lifestyle in America, coming to Israel and unfortunately tasting terrorism on a personal level. We had two Arabs from England, actually, who came over on their English passports, who came to Israel and went into Gaza before we had the security barrier. So before we built the security barrier to protect ourselves from the Arabs living in the disputed territories, they just went into Gaza. They came out of Gaza with suicide belts, and they blew themselves up at a bar that I was working at called Mike's Place in Tel Aviv, right on the beach. And that's really what eventually propelled me to want to join the Army, right, to be able to defend myself after having a friend of mine killed in this way, in a very tragic way. And also, we have to remember that during the Second Intifada, that over 1,000 innocent citizens, 1,000 Israelis were killed during that conflict. We're talking men, women, and children. Right? We're talking people who are going to school, who are riding the bus to work, who are celebrating the Passover celebration, who are going to weddings. These were the places that were attacked by these Palestinian terrorists. So having tasted that and then feeling the need to defend myself and then joining the Army and eventually finding myself in this artillery unit and then being called up into this war, and now I'm confronted with real life and death decisions that need to be made. So I guess the big impact was personal self-discovery and responsibility, and doing what I believe is my fair share in making the world a better place, being an active participant in the world and not just going along with the ride. That's probably the main thing I took away from our relationship and the way I view the world is I think the world in general needs more responsibility, needs more people who are taking active roles in what is happening to our world today.
So you believe that many people are avoiding responsibility for their actions and throughout the world. You see that as a trend?
Definitely. Oh, that's without a doubt. That's without a doubt. With themselves and also with the world just in general, with the things that are happening. I don't think people are really so sensitive to a lot of the misery that's happening in the world today, with a lot of the discomfort that people are going through, and I think people are involved, which we should all be involved with ourselves, but what are we involved with ourselves with? Are we trying to grow? Are we trying to expand ourselves? Are we trying to become more empathetic and compassionate towards other people? Or are we trying to just create more for ourselves? And if we're creating more for ourselves, what's the purpose of that creating for ourselves? Is it just to be loved by other people, to be liked by other people, to be more popular, to be more dominant? I think the world, I think people need to be a little bit more self-reflective and think about the direction that they're moving in.
That's interesting. So I agree with you. I think there's definitely a trend towards more self-absorption throughout the world. And one can sort of look at some of the popular distractions that people have. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, how many followers do I have? So, it's as if people's attention has gone inward rather than outward, I think, to a very large degree.
Right. All those things that you just mentioned can be used in a positive way. I mean, I'm
right.
personally not on Instagram or Twitter, maybe I should be. I am on Facebook, and your listeners can look me up, David Sussman. That's my personal page, or my fan page is David Sussman Israel Tours. I have a touring company here in Israel, and I bring hundreds of people and thousands of people and hundreds of groups here to Israel on wonderful trips throughout the land to learn about the history and the culture and obviously the politics as well. So I definitely look, on probably a weekly basis for sure, how many people are following me, how many new people have connected with me, and I think I'm giving over a lot of positive information, factual information, things for people to think about, to ponder, to see both sides of the situation here, so that they can come with an educated understanding and make an educated decision on how they feel about what's happening here.
Well, let's talk about the history of Israel and try to bring it up to present for our listeners, because some of the listeners of my show may be completely unfamiliar with how Israel even came into existence and what it really means in the world today. We have the headline news every day, but how many people really understand the background for some of the events that are occurring today? What do you think would be some of the important elements for people to understand where Israel is today? So let's go back into history a bit. In your opinion, since you've studied this, and as part of becoming a tour guide, you have to delve into the history of Israel, right? You're very familiar with some of the crucial elements. What do you think are some of the key misconceptions that people have about the very existence of Israel?
Well, first of all, let me just say that something very interesting that I saw today on the street. I saw somebody walk down with a T-shirt. I don't know what the weather is where you are today, but here in Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, it was 75 degrees. So people are already wearing T-shirts. And a guy was walking down the street, and he has a T-shirt on. On the back of it, it says Israel, and it's got the Magen David, the Star of David, the seal of the state of Israel, and a symbol for Jewish people for hundreds of years. And underneath it, it says established 1000 BCE, right, before the Common Era, or BC. Oftentimes people refer to it as BC, right, 1000 BC. So Israel is beyond 1000 BCE. Israel goes back all the way to the time of Abraham, who came here roughly 1800 BCE, right? So we're talking 3,800 years old. Jerusalem was established as our capital during the times of King David. That was 1000 BCE, roughly, give or take a few decades. And then we had the temple here. We had the Jewish kingdom. We had the first temple period. We were sent into an exile. 70 years later, we came back, right? So when people talk about Zionism, there was Zionism 2,500 years ago. Well, we were weeping on the banks of in Babylon, right, on the shores of Babylon. So we were already longing to come back. Then we had the second temple period, and that whole period is roughly about 1,000 years, right, from the time of King David establishing Jerusalem as our capital all the way to the destruction of the second temple, which happened in the year 70 CE. That's over 1,000 years of Jewish independence and Jewish rule here in the land of Israel, and that's undisputable. Today, archaeology has dug up. You can go anywhere in Israel. Robert, come here to Israel, bring a shovel, stay in a hotel, walk out to the pool, and then next to your lounge here, start digging, and you dig 5 feet into the ground, you will find the remains of something that belonged to one of your great-great-great-grandparents or one of your cousins, a family member, somebody who is Jewish who is living in this land, because that's how plentiful the proof is here in the land of Israel of our historical connection to the land. 70 CE, temples destroyed, the Romans take over, they turn some of our holy cities like Jerusalem into pagan capitals here. They allow us to have some type of independence. They give us certain areas in which we can live, basically establishing ghettos within our own land that Jews are allowed to be in. And this continues through the Byzantine period after the Roman period. That goes until 638. Then the Arabs come in, right? The Umayyads, they're the first Arab people who come into the land of Israel. We're talking about 6 years after the death of Muhammad. Most people don't know the history of Islam. Muhammad was only around between 622 and 632, right? For 10 years he was preaching. He was much older than that, but for 10 years he's basically preaching this new religion of Islam. After his death, you have the first major jihad. They come across, they conquered most of the Byzantine Empire, most of the Persian Empire, and they established Jerusalem as a significant city for themselves. Then you have the Crusader period. The Christians come here to the land of Israel. Then the Muslims, conquer the Crusaders again with the Mamluks. And the Mamluks from Egypt are conquered by the Turks, and then the Turks are ruling this area. Then the Turks are conquered by the British. And Robert, this all has to do with the history of Israel and modern history, right? Because the land of Israel today, the state of Israel, including the disputed territories, right, including the areas that the Arabs want to make as a new country called Palestine, even those areas, the disputed areas, as well as Israel today, Israel proper, we'll call it, none of it has been independent, right? None of it has been an independent state, kingdom, country since the fall of the Second Temple, which was during the Jewish rule, until 1948, when the Jews once again declared our independence here in our native land. And that's an important thing to factor in, because when you think about the conflict between the Israelis, the Jews, and the Arabs or the Palestinians, you got to ask yourself, well, where does the name Palestine come from? Do you know where
never
the name
really
Palestine
was.
comes from?
Well, I think that there never really was a Palestinian state before, right? That was called Palestine.
Not only was there never a Palestine, that is true. There was never a state called Palestine or an independent place called Palestine. The name Palestine comes from a reference to a biblical people who arrived here on the shores of Israel around the same time that Joshua crossed and the Israelites crossed over the Jordan River. The Plishtim in Hebrew, the Philistines in English, or the Palestinia in Latin, arrived on the shores of Israel, and they were here during the First Temple period. And when the Romans were here, after they destroyed our temple in the year 70 CE, there was an emperor by the name of Hadrian who named the area. He's so mad at the Jewish people that he renames the area Palestine. It's the first time, 135 CE, that the name Palestine is being used for this land. And since it was never independent, all of these other empires, right, whether it was the Romans or the Byzantine and Constantinople, or even the Arabs themselves, when the Arabs were here in the land of Israel, they never created an independent state here. They were always, their centers were always in Damascus, right, in Syria, or in Egypt, Mecca, Medina, which are their holy places, and Saudi Arabia of today. So the area was never independent, even during the Arab periods. So everybody just called the area, the geographical area, they just referred to as Palestine, because that's what the Romans did. They called it Palestine to name it after our enemies during the First Temple period. So it's just shocking. It's shocking that people try and claim that these Arab people, calling them Palestinian, have some type of ancient historical connection to the land of Israel. It's shocking. It's unbelievably shocking. There's never been a place, Palestine, never any coins printed called Palestine, no presidents, kings, state. It's never existed. And now you even see in the history books where people are saying that Jesus was a Palestinian.
Huh.
And the name for the land here in Israel during the days of Jesus, right? During let's say 0 to 33, which is when historians say Jesus walked the earth, the area was still called Israel, still under Jewish rule. There was still a temple in Jerusalem, here in Jerusalem. So it's people really need to learn the facts. People need to learn the facts.
So is it fair to say, right, I mean, that's a really great, quick historical update to bring us up to modern times. But Based on that, David, is it fair to say that what people are craving in terms of a Palestinian state is something to bring the people together? And is it fair to say that these were displaced people in general throughout history, either being under the rule of the Romans, the Syrians or other Muslim groups? But these people never really had their own country. They never really were Palestinians to begin with.
Right. Well, I mean, as far as the Arabs who are living in the lands of Judea and Samaria, right, which are the disputed territories, the areas that the Arabs want to call Palestine. So talking about those particular Arabs that are living in Judea and Samaria and the disputed territories, right. So most of them, if you look at their names, right, and you look at the lineage of the what the Arabs call a chamula, like the tribes, like the family tribes that live in this disputed territory, you can actually trace back those families to what is today Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and what occurred in the 19th century and the 1800s with the advent of the steam-powered engine and the ships and the ability to travel at a much quicker pace, you see a lot of migration happen. You see a lot of immigration happening to different parts of the world, including America, right? The 19th century, the 1800s, Ellis Island opens up. New York City becomes this huge metropolitan area with so many different types of people flooding its shores. Well, the same thing's happening here in Israel, and Jews from Europe and from Russia and even from, the areas of Yemen and what's today Saudi Arabia and throughout the Middle East are taking advantage of this ability to transport themselves, this ability to move quickly, and they are deciding to return to their native land. They're deciding to return to Israel. And so Jews start to arrive by the tens of thousands, and they need to build homes. They need to cultivate the land. And in order to do that, they need help. They need workers. They need to employ people. And some of these Arab families that we see today living in these disputed territories are families who were peasants, right? Who were peasants 150 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, who were living in Syria and what's today Lebanon and Jordan, right? They were living in these countries, and they saw an opportunity that had begun to develop in the land of Israel, which was being referred to as Palestine by the Turks, right? The Turkish government, Istanbul, who was controlling this area at the time, who allowed the Jews really to start to develop the area as well. A lot of the land, even in the disputed territories, was purchased legally with documentation from the Turkish government or from the landowners, from the citizens of the Turkish Empire who owned the land, that was purchased legally in order to develop the land. So these peasants came here to find employment, and they were paid a fair wage, and they start to build themselves up. And once you have two cultures coming together, eventually there's going to be some type of conflict. And already by 1929, right? By 1929, which isn't that long ago, but by 1929, you have this individual who is sort of the leader of the Arab people living in this area. And again, there's no name for the area. It's not independent. But now it's not the Turks, right? The Turkish government lost their power in the land of Israel. They lost it in World War I to the British. So now it's under the British Empire, right? All these different empires ruling the land, never independent, right? So now the British are ruling the land, and this guy rises up. His name is Sheikh Husseini. Sheikh Husseini, right? He's the spiritual leader and the political leader of the Arab people, and he instigates riots throughout the land of Israel, and particularly in the city of Hebron, right? Hebron, where the tomb of Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, right? Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, their wives, where they're buried in Hebron. It's in the news today, where there was a continual Jewish existence, a continual Jewish presence living in the city of Hebron from the times of Abraham, 3,800 years ago, all the way up until 1929. That's unbelievable to think of a people keeping their tradition, their culture, their names, all of that throughout the centuries and the millennia, living in one place, and all of a sudden it's destroyed because the Arabs start to riot. They slaughter and kill over 70 Jews, and the British who are ruling the land go into the city, forcibly evict or evacuate all the Jews who are living there and say, it's for your better, it's for your betterment to leave this city because the Arabs are going to kill the rest of you, instead of trying to put a stop to it and telling the Arabs, hey, this is not a civilized way to behave. Stop killing innocent people. Instead, they say, no. You need to pull out and you need to give this land to the Arabs, right? So already we see this happen in 1929, Sheikh Husseini. And for the first time in over 3,000 years, Jews aren't living in the holy city of Hebron, and they're forcibly removed. In 1936, 3 years after the election of Hitler, Sheikh Husseini, the same guy, instigates more riots throughout the land that last for a number of years, all the way up until 1939, the beginning of World War II, and Sheikh Husseini begs Hitler, goes to Hitler and says, Hitler, please come to the land of Israel, right? Please come to the territory that has been referred to as Palestine for the last 1,800 years because it's never been independent, and come here with your planes and your tanks and finish our Jewish problem that exists here as well. Now, what do you think the British did when they heard about that?
Well, this is before they got involved in the war, right?
Well, this would still be during the time of Chamberlain, but I wouldn't say that. This would be during the time of Chamberlain, before the time of Churchill, but nonetheless, right. The British aren't. I wouldn't call them friends with Adolf Hitler in Germany. So here you have a guy within the British mandate, right? Because this area is controlled by England, and he's begging the German dictator Adolf Hitler to come to Israel, to come to the land of Israel, to come.
Well,
to,
did they
to what
do
was
something
to?
Did they do something to silence this sheik?
Yeah, well, they kicked him out of the land. They kicked him out of Israel. So he goes to Germany, and he becomes an advisor to Adolf Hitler. And he leads a brigade, the same guy, right? The same guy, this Arab who referred to himself as Palestinian, leads a brigade of German soldiers into Croatia and eliminates, murders, slaughters over 40,000 Jews of Croatia, almost completely eliminating the Jewish population in Croatia during this time.
Well,
so it's been a long history that a conflict that's been going on here.
Right. I think it makes it difficult for the average person who's not as well versed in the details of the history to take a position today, because the world is a very preoccupied place, and Israel for some people might look like a thorn in their side. Where do these people, right? Because it's a small country, it gets a lot of attention, a lot of news, and people have very strong feelings about Israel today, pro and con, I think. But I think that based on what we've heard today, which I'm so glad to have you on the show, David, you have really clarified things for my listeners, including myself. I've learned things I didn't know about the history of that area. And, the one thing that strikes me after listening to the historical background for the state of Israel is, it's so interesting how Different countries try and yield their influence over people, but it always shifts, right? It could be the Turks, it could be the English, but it's the people are living in these places, and they're under the rule of all different kinds of foreign countries or foreign forces. And one could understand that they're looking for something of their own, but to put it in historical perspective, there never was anything relating to an independent Palestinian state in any of history. I mean, it's pretty clear that that's true, but it doesn't mean that the people who are living there have no needs, have no right to something, just like everybody in this world. And I think I think that really puts it in perspective. We're all human beings living on the planet, and we have to do something to help us live together. I think ultimately you have to come out on that side. There has to be some way for people to live together without trying to kill each other all the time.
Right. Well, it's interesting to say that, Robert, because I think it's also a very important thing for the world to understand is that the government here in Israel has openly stated that they are looking forward, right? Not like looking forward as in they're excited or something like that, but they are looking like forward, like trying to see ahead and in the future, and to say, hey, the only way to have a true lasting peace here in the land is for a two-state solution. Nobody's denying that. I mean, you do have small factions who are, but when you look at Bibi Netanyahu and you look at the Likud party, and Bibi Netanyahu, who I think is portrayed often in American media and around the world as being this crazy, fanatic right-winger, this warmonger, and not as a moderate. He is the first prime minister here in Israel to openly say that I agree and am willing to work towards a two-state solution. Not even Yitzhak Rabin ever stated in a speech openly to the public that he agreed or thought that the best solution was for two states. Not even Yitzhak Rabin. Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, is the first prime minister to state that. So I think it's important for the world to realize that, yes, everybody here in Israel and in the disputed territories, whether they are Arab, whether they're Muslim, Christian, whether they're Israeli, Jewish, wants to have peace, right? And we all want other individuals to be able to profit from their work and to live happily and to watch their children grow up and to get married and to have children of their own. That's a dream that is shared by all of humanity. And that's something that us Israelis and the government wants for the Arabs if they want to call themselves Palestinian or whatever they want to call themselves Palestinian. Who are we to tell them who they are? However, in order to achieve that, we need to have a true partner in peace. And the world needs to understand that Mahmoud Abbas, who's the president of the Palestinian Authority, is not that man, right? Mahmoud Abbas, he pays the terrorists in the jails. He pays the families of terrorists. He accepts money from Iran that you just mentioned at the beginning of the show to give $30,000 for every house that's demolished of a terrorist. This is only going to excite individuals who have been radicalized by watching TV or listening to a sermon in a mosque to go ahead and not only get their 72 virgins in heaven or to be accepted into heaven, to be able to sit on the right-hand side of Muhammad because they killed an innocent Jew, but not only that, they're going to leave behind $30,000 for a new house, and their families will get a monthly stipend from the government because they did this. So Mahmoud Abbas is not a partner for peace. He openly states all the time that there will not be one Jew, there will not be allowed one Jew to walk in the land of Palestine. In this new state of Palestine, not one Jew will be allowed there. That's crazy. That's crazy that the international community views this type of rhetoric as being moderate and Bibi Netanyahu as being a completely right-wing fanatic. I think Bibi
let me ask you
Netanyahu
something.
needs to stand strong.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that Bibi is viewed as a right-winger in the United States by the media. He's not portrayed as a moderate. You're correct about that. But why do you think there is this proclivity to do this? Is it because there is such an apparent inequality in power between the Israelis and the Arabs in the occupied territory, in the disputed territory? Is it because there's such a glaring disparity in prosperity, in opportunity? Do you think that has something to do with why the world just automatically labels them as a victim and allows them things that they wouldn't allow the Israelis to say and do?
Right. Well, first of all, I just want to clarify, it's not the occupied territories. That's a loaded term, and it's an incorrect term that's been used in the media and throughout the world so often that many times people just automatically assume that that's the correct term for that area. It's the disputed territories. It's never been independent since the fall of the Second Temple, not in 1948 because there was a war here, the War of Independence. The Jordanians controlled those areas of Judea and Samaria. The world didn't recognize the Jordanian ownership of the land, and then the Jordanians refused to make peace with Israel, even though we oftentimes came to them and said, hey, let's keep the border as is right now in 1949, the Armistice Agreement, which unfortunately is oftentimes referred to as the 67 borders, has nothing to do with 1967, has nothing to do with borders because there was no border between Israel and Jordan. There was only an armistice line, a ceasefire line from the War of Independence. And in 1967, the Jordanians attacked Israel, right? The Jordanians attacked Israel, and it was a defensive war that Israel was defending itself. And during the period of our defense, we were able to take over a section of land which by international law and according to The Hague post-1967 until recent times even stated that this was a defensive war and Israel has the right to that property. That being said, as soon as the Six-Day War, 1967 was over, Israel went to the Arab nations and to the Arab League and said, we don't want this piece of land. We just want peace, and if you're willing to sign a peace treaty with you, we'll establish the border along the 1949 Armistice Agreement, or which is wrongly thought of as the 67 borders, but they refused that as well. So it's not occupied territories, it's the disputed territories, right?
Okay,
Israel's
I stand
never
corrected.
officially annexed that land.
Okay.
So I think it's just, never mind you, but also I think that the listeners really need to understand that point. I think it's a very important point to understand because if you think of it as being occupied, you immediately think that the people who are living there, the Arabs, have some type of historical right to that land, and that would be untrue. Now, that being said, the people who live there have some type of right to independence, if that's what they're looking for, or they should become Israeli citizens. Now, Israel doesn't want them to become Israeli citizens because that will change the demographics. So Israel's saying, okay, we will give you your state, but we need to have a partner in peace who can guarantee that in 5 years' time, you're not going to invite all of the jihadists that we see in ISIS in Syria, which has killed 270,000 people in the last 3.5 years, or you're going to bring all the jihadists that we see in Iraq blowing up mosques in different places, or you're going to bring the jihadists that we see in Libya to your new country, Palestine, and bring them to the borders of Israel, and now we're going to have a serious conflict on our hands. We need a government in Palestine. We need a government in a new Arab state that is going to be strong enough to keep the peace and to work with Israel hand in hand in order to secure this region for a brighter future. And Mahmoud Abbas just simply isn't that man.
David, I hate to end the show on that note, but it's been a fascinating talk with you. I could talk for hours about this subject, and I'm sure we've only whetted the appetite of our listeners. I'd love to have you back on another occasion to continue the discussion.
Robert, you're fantastic.
You're listening to Monergy Life with host Robert Fisher and David Sussman. And David, the best way to get in touch with you is through email davidthetourguide@gmail.com. Is that it?
That's correct. But really, if anybody wants to contact me, I always suggest people to friend me on Facebook. And I put a lot of information out on Facebook. They can look me up at David Sussman Israel Tours. That's my company on Facebook. Or they can just look me up, David Sussman, on Facebook. I'm here in Israel. Or like you said, my email address, which is davidthetourguide@gmail.com. My website, davidsussmanisraeltours.com. There's a number of ways that they can get a hold of me.
David, a real pleasure to have you on today. And I want to thank my listeners again for tuning into Monergy Life. Have a great afternoon. David, thank you again.
Thanks,
you so
Robert.
much.
Be well.
Good.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Care.